Welcome to the i3 Business Solutions webinar on cybersecurity and compliance. Where does compliance and regulation fit into business and organizational management? My name is Mike Ritzema with i3 Business Solutions. I'm joined by our CTO and digital forensic and incident response certified by Lloyd's of London, our CTO, Brian Abraham, and Greg Heighton, senior consultant and certified information security professional, the highest level of cybersecurity certification you can get. So let's talk about first, every business's priority. I believe every owner, every executive is interested in four things. I certainly am. We have to be profitable, sustainable for an organization to run the business. Productivity, automation and AI, all the rage today. How can we automate from manual tasks to automated tasks? How can we do that? Improve productivity and efficiency. Differentiation. How am I different from the competition? How do I stand out? But most importantly, I think the number one priority for me and most executives and owners is risk management. And that is physical, financial, and technological. Physical risk, let's make sure stuff's not walking out the door. Let's use locks and security cameras. Financial risk, let's make sure we don't, ship a bunch of money to the wrong account. Let's manage the financial cash flow and profitability of the organization, high priority. And then technological risk. And let's make sure that we don't encrypt everything in the organization. Let's protect the information, the data, the lifeblood, the intellectual property, the personal and private information of the organization. Let's protect that. I think that every business is moving from people excellence to include process excellence. So when we look at risk and process, who owns the risk? And I'll pull in both Brian and Greg at this time and say, who owns the risk? And the technological risk, who owns it? Who owns the financial risk? And my answer certainly is the owners, the executives of the organization own the risk. In fact, the technology, the IT department, or the technology firm, they're the stewards of the risk. Any comments on that, Brian?
Yeah, I feel a lot of IT professionals and managers feel like they own the risk, but it's really, like you said, Mike, it's the business owner, it's the principals that are responsible for the organization. The IT people, the managers, the companies involved in managing IT, their responsibility is to identify and present that risk in a clear way to the ownership structure to make business decisions around how to manage that risk.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Greg.
And I appreciate that you called out data ownership. A lot of times that gets overlooked as an asset. And that's a good thing to keep in mind is understanding what you're protecting. And that's a big portion of compliance is know what you're protecting, know your assets, and put a plan in place to protect those assets.
Indeed, the responsibility of the data steward, the IT manager, the IT company is to call out the risk, help understand the risk specifically within technology. So then when we move beyond that, when we look at a company and we grow a company from 5 to 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 500, the risk that you're managing moves. And so there's a progression to that. And smaller organizations might say, well, the compliance demands, the regulation demands, not that high on my radar. But as an organization grows and maybe has opportunities from the federal government, from different organizations, bigger enterprises that demand more cybersecurity, demand more compliance or regulation, these things start to move. So we look at business outcomes and we say, how do we manage risk to deliver business results? Greg, how does that fit in your framework for governance, risk, compliance, and a business moving forward?
Yeah, governance is really Governance and compliance is really a life cycle. It's not just a one and done, we made it to secure and we're good to go. It's an evolving methodology. So you start with auditing, find out where you're at, recognize the risks. And then once you've recognized the risks, you can put a plan in place to start moving toward a less risky posture. That can be things like policy, that can be things like technology, that can be a lot of different options. And you mentioned compliance requirements is one thing pushing this, but one other piece that's also pushing this pretty heavily is insurance. Getting cyber liability insurance is more and more pushing companies to be more compliant and more secure. The less the risk, the less likely an insurance company is to have to pay out. And at the end of the day, that's what they want. But as a benefit, businesses are also becoming more secure by adding these common sense controls in place, putting things in place to mitigate risk, as opposed to just letting it sit.
Exactly. Anything to add to it, Brian?
Oh, I was just going to say on the insurance side of things, one of the horror stories that we hear about in the industry is that when a company has an event, the insurance doesn't pay because they weren't actually doing the things that they said they were doing. Somebody checked a box on a form saying that they were doing something. It wasn't actually occurring. There was no evidence that it was being done. So the insurance company doesn't pay in those situations.
Yeah, that's exactly it is. And again, as we move through growing a business, sometimes as an entrepreneur, the priority is grow the business, find business, do business. And then we progressively, we implement processes to support the growth of the business. And that risk management changes also. And at some point, the cybersecurity insurance, the intellectual property of the company, the width of the company, the risk moves to a compliance or regulation demand on the business. So then there's lots of ways to manage risk. And certainly there's spreadsheets. I think a lot of us have done it on a spreadsheet, a Word document, and there are tool or framework type options. But again, as the business grows, at some point, we might get up and say the regulation for the quote opportunity, the RFP I'm going after, demands regulation or levels of cybersecurity. I'm pursuing an enterprise that says you have to demonstrate this level of cybersecurity. So the compliance, the regulations demand it as our company grows. Different ways to do this. What have you guys seen? I'll start with Greg on, how to manage the cybersecurity, the compliance, the regulation of an organization.
Yeah, there's varying difficulties to each of the different methods to documenting this. A spreadsheet is simple to set up. It's easy to get started, but it's as you get more and more complex in your compliance requirements, you start to get to the point where it's not as manageable. You have more and more controls that you have to identify and make sure that you're meeting those. You have more complex requirements that maybe aren't as easy to document in a spreadsheet. That's where you start getting into compliance management tools, and those are specifically designed to help not only document what exists, but then also help move toward more secure methodologies. So better frameworks, better, more controls, more accurate documentation, better evidence locker. Those types of things are what will help you at the point that you need an audit. When you're self-attesting, it's simple enough to say, yeah, we do that thing. And as Brian pointed out, when something happens, and we do say when instead of if, you want to have all of that documented and easily presentable to either auditors or somebody who needs that information. That, again, can be policies, controls, all kinds of different documents that you might need to prove that you're doing what you're saying you're doing.
Yeah, and I would just add to that doing it manually with a spreadsheet in Word, in OneNote, in some static form gets you to a place and time, right? You can manage that as a kind of one-time activity. It's very difficult to manage it going forward with a system like that, especially as the business changes, as the security requirements change, the compliance requirements change, or maybe you want to add a new compliance that you're trying to pursue with your company to either win a new contract, or maybe it's a requirement on your business due to the nature of your business. When you're doing it manually, now you have to start that whole thing all over again. You can't easily map what you already have in place to the new requirements that are needed.
Exactly. And so again, parallel to the owners or the executives handling that risk, if a client demands SOC 2 Type 2, it's like, oh crap, we have to certify in this way in order to win that business. That's kind of demanding to manage in a spreadsheet, especially if you need an audit. If you're SOX or FINRA in the finance industry, PCI, as your organization grows and the demands on credit card processing change, these type of frameworks and regulation impact the business. So we have a solution at i3 Business Solutions. Brian, it's called Fortress Risk and Compliance Navigator. Tell us a little bit about why one might want to consider a tool or move from a spreadsheet and saying, we've got this.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like Greg said, this is a living, breathing life cycle that you have to go through, right? So it's not, you have to get to a point in time to start, right? So you know where you are today, but then you have to continually monitor, improve, and document your progress along this life cycle. Doing that in a spreadsheet or a document is very labor intensive and very hard to keep up with it and manage it on an ongoing basis, right? So what a tool like this does, and the one that we've partnered with, has built-in policies and templates. So once you document your environment, you can see how you are pre-mapped across all of the different compliance frameworks, whether it's CMMC, NIST, HIPAA, PCI, and a lot of organizations have multiple frameworks that they need to comply with. You might have a manufacturing environment that has CMMC requirements for a government contract. You also might be storing HIPAA compliant data for employees, and you might also be taking credit cards for payments. So it's possible, likely that a lot of companies have to kind of maintain compliance with several different frameworks.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes we see regulation as a bottleneck. Oh crap, we have to meet this regulation in order to do business. Whereas the opposite can be true. It actually improves business results by helping me stand out from the others that I have CMMC level 2 certification, which allows me to pursue this business and win this business and puts me in a more narrow vendor category. We've seen that with our clients, right, Brian, as they pursue government contracts and they need a certification to get there, CMMC, a higher level of certification, it sets them apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might have implemented SOC 2 security, and when you feed all your information into this tool, it'll, let you know, hey, I'm also, NIST certified. I also have this other compliance certification, or there's one other thing we have to do, and we can hit this next level of certification. So it paints a great picture of kind of where your posture is.
Yeah, that affirms exactly what I said earlier, that the journey of business is managing risk and choosing how much risk and where to move that risk and how to manage it with insurance and so on. But secondly, managing process And as we grow an organization, we put more and more process execution into it. SOC 2, Type 2, nothing more than proving that I have excellent processes all across the organization, and that serves to win business and move the company forward. So our risk and compliance navigator service gets a little bit complex, doesn't it? Because managing compliance and regulation and governing it is like a spider web, right? It reaches out in so many different ways, Brian.
Yeah, it does. So the more automation you can build in, you're light years ahead in terms of labor effort. Doing all of these tasks manually involve kind of hundreds of hours of manual information gathering. So the more you can tie in and automate, right? Automatically pull in your 365, like your M365 data, your EDR, MDR security software, your security awareness training, right? You can integrate with your security awareness training platform. So you have verification that, not only do you have it, it's gone out to your employees, they're enrolled in it, and they've completed it. And that's all kind of tied into the platform. And you can kick out a report, with all those green lights that say, we're compliant, or here's the areas where we're not. We have a couple of employees that haven't completed their training. They need to move through it yet.
Yeah, which in most compliance and regulation environments, much like a house inspection, very tough to hit 100%. So when you demonstrate that you're organized and are moving this process forward, even as the regulations and compliance change over time, this allows one to demonstrate exactly that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you want to have all of your information, once you've done this, right, be able to store it in a way that you can present it to an auditor, to a company that requests it. We see that a lot with, especially manufacturing suppliers, right? The big companies, the tier ones that they're supplying to, they're demanding evidence from their suppliers that, they're doing the things that they're saying they're doing.
Yeah. I'll turn it over to Greg here, and he's going to go through just a little bit of a view of the tool, which starts with a gap analysis and then gets into how do we manage policy and prove that everybody in the company has reviewed the policy and understands the policy, and then what is an evidence locker and where does this information go? Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I will share out my screen here and give a quick overview then. A couple of things I wanted to point out too that you touched on. There is a lot of overlap between each of these different frameworks, and it's good to point out that the more you increase your security in one aspect, it's helping you in your other compliance pieces as well. So it's not just that you're doing one compliance thing at a time, you're making your organization more secure, which is really the goal of compliance. So here is a quick overview of our platform. This is one of the certifications that we're testing or that we're going through ourselves. And this gives an overview of what controls are in place, how we identify them. This is the actual gap assessment that Mike mentioned. So this is recognizing what do you have in place, what do you plan to have in place, what maybe isn't applicable in your case, and what else you might need to do for each of these different areas. And this is a fairly complex compliance. There are varying degrees of how many controls. And when I say control, that just means something that reduces the risk. That might be a policy, that might be a technology, and there are all kinds of different ones depending on the framework that applies to you. That might be HIPAA, might be CMMC, and there are evolving levels to each of these. So for example, CMMC level 1 is a lot less controls that you're required to show, whereas a CMMC level 2, you're going to look at a lot more controls, a lot more planning involved, and a lot more oversight. And that oversight goes into policies. So The other big point that Mike made, and I will reiterate, is that this is not just a way to check where your risk is. It's also a tool that you can use for managing your own policies. That can be a task in itself when you have to update an acceptable use policy, bring your own device. Maybe you don't have that policy and you need to create it. This is a place where you can build out those policies. And then beyond that, provide a way for your employees to sign off on those policies and prove that they have signed off on it and that they've read it. A lot of times you might just have a folder on your shared drive or in SharePoint where you just put all your policies and just let them be there and trust that your employees are checking them. This gives a repeatable and provable way to show that people have read and agreed to these policies. So once you've done the gap assessment, that's where we get into planning, the planning portion of the life cycle. This is empty for us right now, but this is a good overview. This will tell us where the highest risks are. Top right is something that's almost certainly going to happen, and it's going to have devastating impact on the business. The more bottom left are the things that are a little less likely to happen or a little less severe. So the idea is we want to focus on the very likely, very catastrophic, or things that are easy to fix. There could very well be something in the very high category that's easy to fix. MFA is a good example of something that is simple to put in place, and it addresses multiple controls that are very high impact severity or very likely to happen. So this is a way to build out a plan and focus on those things that are most important to the business. And it helps give some guardrails for what should we be doing. Because one thing we see is when you sign up for a compliance framework, when you say, yes, we want to be CMMC certified, there's a lot that goes into that, and you can get stuck with, I don't know where to even start. This gives you a place to not only start, but it gives you a plan and steps to go about that. And you don't necessarily have to address every single thing on a list. That is the nice thing about compliance, is there's some of them are a little more flexible than others, where maybe you don't need all of the controls exactly at the highest tier, but you're starting that journey. You're moving toward that compliance, and these do typically take time. So that's something to keep in mind as well. It's a process and a life cycle. So
Greg, the platform and the service integrate to an evidence locker. What is an evidence locker, and how does it tie into this?
Yeah, good question. The evidence locker that we use is tied directly to a SharePoint site. There are a couple of different locations that you can store the evidence locker depending on your platform, Google Drive or Google Docs. We chose SharePoint just because that's what we use. So the evidence locker is where you can not only store all of the evidence of what you've done and proven that you've done, but it's something that you can provide to an auditor when you get to the point of, now I need to prove what we're doing. It makes it significantly easier to have a centralized location where all of your documents are, instead of having to go to disparate locations to try to find them, get them presentable, and then present them, because you really want to provide an auditor with just what they're asking for when they ask for it. So that's an overview of that evidence locker.
Beautiful. Thank you. So Brian, as we come back to life cycle, I want to talk a minute about controls, because I think that in business and maybe in technology, we talk about checkboxes. We talk about checkboxes. I'm going to check a box. And I like to talk about process. In business, we want excellent processes. I think quality comes from process excellence. But in this case, we're talking about controls. In CIS, there's 18 controls. And when we look at compliance and regulation, sometimes I think we think, well, we check the boxes for the firewall and the antivirus and we're good. Oh, we got MFA. It's all tech. So talk a little bit about controls as opposed to, firewalls and antivirus.
Yeah, so I mean, with controls, you want to have a framework that kind of manages you kind of for the things that you're trying to affect in the environment, right? So, and like we said, this is a full life cycle from a point in time to where you want to get to. Along the way, you're going to implement policies, you're going to implement software, technologies. All of those are different types of controls that kind of keep you monitored and managed within that security space. Um, and it's continuous, right? Your business is going to evolve over time. The products, the clients that you're working with are going to evolve over time. And either government regulation or the requirements that are put on you are going to evolve over time. So being able to navigate that in a simple, seamless way and apply those new regulations to your current posture is just going to make it monumentally easier to navigate that.
Yeah, and then this view, a summary of the life cycle, which goes from strategy, includes policies, processes, performance, risk, and then the controls again. It all comes together to deliver a compliance or regulation solution that we can manage going forward. The Navigator service from i3 includes our coordination of that with your team, navigating it. And then you choose whether you want to execute internally to get things done or say, oh, we'd like some help from I3 on that as we move through this regulation or compliance demand. Anything to add to that, Greg or Brian?
I would just say, like Greg pointed out as he's kind of giving the demo, the best thing from it is kind of the how to get started, right? It's the how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? You gotta start somewhere, and being able to see in a very simple way after you've done your gap assessment, here's the things we need to work on, here's our roadmap going forward, really puts you on a path towards managing that compliance.
Yes.
And I like that you pointed out that it's a back and forth. It's a team effort here, because a lot of what compliance is looking for is policy driven, which the business determines their own policy depending on their business needs, and it's not going to match with every business. And that's where we can step in and say, okay, this makes sense for your business, or it doesn't make sense for your business. And we can work with whoever is in charge of or responsible for compliance internally and build out not only the check boxes, but then the improved culture, the focus on security internally, and get that buy-in that a lot of times you might not get if you're just going after something for going after it. For example, maybe installing antivirus software across the organization. Installing it for the sake of installing it is one thing, but getting buy-in from everybody on this is why it's important is a really important piece of what compliance can help push.
Exactly. Beautiful. As we wrap up, we're talking about risk management, we're talking about governance, risk, and compliance. I submit that every organization, every business, regulated or not, already has governance, risk, and compliance. And your business priorities, your goals will define when it's time to get organized and say, we're taking this thing to the next level because it's required to grow the business, to move the organization forward. Only the executives, only the owners know that answer. My mandate today, know your risk, govern your risk, and own your risk. Do not delegate that. And the action item is, contact any one of us if you want to talk more about governance, risk, and compliance and getting organized around that in order to grow your business.